There's a specific kind of Sunday morning that only people who live alone truly know. No alarm, no negotiation over what to have for breakfast, no one else's moods filling the room before you've had a chance to find your own. You make coffee at whatever pace you want, put on whatever you want, sit in whatever position your body decides is right, and the morning just unfolds. Quietly, on your terms, completely. And if you're someone who lives alone and thrives in it, you know that this morning isn't a consolation prize for a life that didn't go another way. It is the life. It is, without apology, exactly what you chose. Now watch how fast the world rushes in to tell you that something is wrong with that. Because we live in a culture that has decided, collectively and with enormous confidence, that the end point of a well-lived human life involves sharing it with someone else under the same roof. That solitude is a waiting room, that living alone is either a temporary inconvenience between relationships or a quiet tragedy to be pitied from a comfortable distance. And if you dare to suggest that you actually love living alone, that it isn't a consolation prize but a genuine, considered, deeply satisfying way to exist, people look at you with that particular expression, the one that says they believe you but not quite, the one that says they're giving it time. But here's what the psychology actually says, and it is far more interesting than the cultural story. People who genuinely thrive living alone are not people who failed at togetherness. They are not damaged, commitment-phobic, emotionally unavailable, or secretly miserable behind a well-maintained facade. Research increasingly shows that people who live alone and flourish in it tend to share a very specific constellation of psychological traits that are not deficits. They are, in many meaningful ways, profound strengths. And understanding those traits, understanding what is actually happening in the mind and nervous system of someone who comes alive in their own company, changes everything about how we interpret this choice. Let's start with the most misunderstood one: introversion. Not shyness, which is different, not social anxiety, which is also different. Introversion, in the clinical and research sense, refers to where a person draws their energy from. Extroverts recharge in the presence of others. Social interaction fills them up, energizes them, sends them back into the world feeling more alive than when they entered the room. Introverts are the opposite, not because people drain them in a negative way, but because their nervous systems process social stimulation more deeply and more intensely, which means that after extended social engagement, the introvert system needs time alone to return to baseline. Living alone, for a genuine introvert, isn't isolation, it's calibration. It's the environment that allows their nervous system to function at its best, rather than constantly managing the overstimulation of shared space. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people adds another layer here. Highly sensitive people, who make up roughly 15 to 20% of the population, have nervous systems that process environmental and emotional information more deeply than average. They notice more, they feel more, they absorb more of what's in a room, which makes them extraordinarily empathetic and perceptive, but also means that environments with high sensory or social input are genuinely more taxing for them than for others. For this type of person, living alone isn't a preference, it's almost a physiological necessity. Their best thinking, their deepest creativity, their most genuine emotional processing all happens in quiet space. Take that space away and you don't just make them uncomfortable, you diminish them. But introversion and sensitivity are only part of the picture, because plenty of people who thrive living alone are not introverts in the classic sense. Some are deeply social, warmly connected, full of rich friendships and active lives, and they still come home to their own space and feel completely right about it. For these people, something else is at work, something that psychologists call a high need for autonomy. Autonomy, in psychological terms, is one of the three core human needs identified by self-determination theory, the framework developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan that has become one of the most robust models of human motivation in modern psychology. Alongside competence and relatedness, autonomy, the need to feel that your choices are genuinely your own, that your life is self-directed rather than externally controlled, sits at the center of psychological well-being. And living alone is, in its purest form, an exercise in autonomy. Every decision in your space is yours. The temperature, the schedule, the soundtrack, the dinner, the Saturday morning routine that would drive another person insane, but that is perfectly, precisely calibrated to what your particular mind and body need. For people with a high need for autonomy, that level of self-determination is not selfishness, it is oxygen. There's a concept in psychology called solitude capacity, and it's exactly what it sounds like: the ability to be alone without being lonely, to sit with yourself without needing to fill the silence, to be genuinely, comfortably present in your own company. Research by psychologist Esther Buchholz, who spent decades studying the human need for alone time as a counterbalance to attachment, found that solitude capacity is not just a personality quirk, it is a marker of psychological maturity. People who can tolerate and enjoy their own company tend to have stronger senses of self, more clearly defined values, higher emotional regulation, and, paradoxically, more satisfying relationships with others, precisely because they don't enter those relationships from a place of need or emptiness. Think about that for a moment. The people who thrive living alone often have better relationships because of it, not in spite of it. They choose connection rather than requiring it for survival. They show up to friendships and relationships as whole people, bringing something to the table rather than half people looking for someone to complete them. And that distinction between chosen connection and desperately needed connection makes an enormous difference in the quality and depth of every relationship they enter. There's also something deeply creative about living alone that doesn't get discussed enough. A disproportionate number of writers, artists, composers, scientists, and thinkers throughout history have lived alone, or at least sought extensive periods of solitude, not because they're broken or antisocial, but because the particular kind of deep, uninterrupted thinking that creative and intellectual work requires happens in space, in silence, in the long, unstructured, seemingly empty hours that shared living tends to fill with other things. Neuroscience gives us a useful frame here, too. The default mode network, the part of your brain that activates during rest, daydreaming, and inward reflection, is increasingly understood as central to creativity, self-understanding, memory consolidation, and the generation of original ideas. It activates most powerfully when you are alone and unstimulated, when you're not responding to another person, managing social dynamics, or navigating shared space. People who live alone get more of this, more default mode network activation, more internal processing time, more of the mental conditions that produce insight, self-knowledge, and original thinking. Their brains, quite literally, get to do things that crowded lives make harder. None of this means that living alone is superior to living with others. It isn't. It means something different for different nervous systems, different personalities, different life structures. There are people for whom shared life is genuinely nourishing, who grow more fully in the presence of a partner or family, whose best selves emerge through the daily negotiation and intimacy of cohabitation. That is equally real and equally valid. Human needs are not one size. But the people who thrive living alone deserve to have their experience named correctly, not as a compromise, not as a phase, not as evidence of something missing, as a legitimate, psychologically grounded, genuinely flourishing way of being human, one that requires self-knowledge, that produces depth, that enables a particular kind of freedom that is harder to find any other way. So if you're someone who closes the door to your own space and feels in that quiet moment something that can only be described as rightness and relief, I want you to hear this clearly. That feeling is not a red flag. It is not loneliness wearing a convincing disguise. It might just be your particular, beautifully specific inner life recognizing the conditions it needs to be fully itself. And honestly, that kind of self-knowledge is rarer than most people realize. Tell me in the comments, are you someone who thrives living alone? What does your space give you that shared life doesn't? I always find the answers to that question more revealing and more poetic than people expect. And if you want to keep exploring the quiet, underrated psychology of the way certain people move through the world, subscribe and come back. There's so much more worth understanding about yourself.